In a world where power often speaks louder than justice, a nation rose up to rewrite its destiny. This is the story of Burkina Faso, a land of proud people and a leader who dared to challenge the giants. In the heart of West Africa, under a sun that forged resilience in its people, a drama of courage and sovereignty unfolded. A nation rich in gold, but long impoverished by exploitation, found in a young captain the personification of an ancient desire to be its own master. This is not just the chronicle of a political decision. It is the epic of a people who, against all odds, chose dignity over submission, the future over a chained present. Prepare to discover the saga of Ibrahim Traoré and the silent revolution that echoed across continents, a testament that the true wealth of a nation lies in the courage to say no. At the center of this geopolitical hurricane emerges the figure of Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose rise to power was as swift as the pulse of a heart in battle. He was not a career politician, molded in the corridors of power and diplomatic dealings. On the contrary, he was a son of the nation, a soldier who felt the pains and hopes of his people in his own skin. His arrival to leadership was no mere accident, but the result of a popular cry for change, for a leadership that would speak the language of truth and honor. In his eyes, the population saw not just the authority of a ruler, but the determination of an older brother ready to defend his family. He became the symbol of a new era, a beacon of hope for a youth who refused to accept a destiny of subservience, a leader who promised not just to govern, but to liberate. The plot thickens with the arrival of a proposal from across the ocean, a siren song wrapped in promises of prosperity and security. On Traoré's table lay a deal that could transform Burkina Faso's economy overnight. Corporations aligned with Western interests offered massive investments in infrastructure, access to cutting-edge resource extraction technologies, and strategic security partnerships. In return, they wanted priority rights to the country's vast gold reserves and newly discovered oil fields. It was the classic resources for influence offer, a pact that, at first glance, seemed irresistible. The nation, in dire need of development and plagued by instability, found itself at a historic crossroads. To accept the outstretched hand and reap the immediate benefits, or to risk everything in the name of a higher ideal. The decision weighed heavily on Traoré's shoulders, and the world held its breath. The deal was a masterpiece of geopolitical seduction, each clause designed to dazzle and convince. There was talk of billions of dollars that would irrigate the economy, of the construction of roads, hospitals, and schools that would change the face of the country. The end of isolation was promised, and Burkina Faso's entry into the select club of rising nations. The promised technology would revolutionize the extractive industry, multiplying production and profits. The security partnerships, in turn, would be the key to pacifying a country scarred by conflict. It was a bright future, gift-wrapped and delivered with a smile. For a leader of a nation with so many needs, the temptation was immense. It was the opportunity to offer his people a shortcut to progress, to silence critics, and to consolidate his power. But, as in every fairy tale, the magic had a price, and the fine print of the contract hid a cost not measured in money. Diving into the depths of the agreement, Traoré and his closest advisors began to see the invisible chains that would bind Burkina Faso's future. Granting priority rights over gold and oil meant, in practice, handing over control of the country's greatest riches to foreign interests. The nation would become a mere spectator in the exploitation of its own resources, receiving only a fraction of the profits. The promised infrastructure would be built not to serve the people, but to facilitate the flow of wealth to distant ports. Technological dependence would create a bond of subservience, and the security partnerships could turn into a political leash. It was the repetition of a script already known across the continent. a vicious cycle of exploitation disguised as aid, benefiting external actors while perpetuating local poverty. The choice became increasingly clear. It was between an illusory progress and real sovereignty. The pressure on Traoré was overwhelming, coming from all directions. Foreign diplomats whispered about the consequences of a refusal, about the isolation and sanctions that would follow. Within his own government, voices rose in favor of pragmatism, arguing that the country could not afford to reject such a generous offer. Economic elites, with interests tied to international capital, mobilized their influence to ensure the deal was signed. These were tense days in the palaces of Ouagadougou, filled with secret meetings and enigmatic phone calls. The narrative they tried to impose was that Traoré would be a fool to refuse, a radical who would lead his country to ruin for an ideological whim. Every argument, every veiled threat was an attempt to bend his will, to convince him that the only reasonable way out was submission. Behind the offer, powerful figures moved, their names evoking the centers of global power. There was talk of Donald Trump and of corporations with a history of predatory actions in developing nations. Their motives were clear: to secure access to strategic resources in an increasingly competitive world, and at the same time to maintain Western influence in a region that was showing signs of rebellion. For them, Burkina Faso was just another piece on the great chessboard of geopolitics, a source of wealth to be exploited and a position to be controlled. There was no room for sentimentality or for the notion of popular sovereignty. What was at stake was profit and power, and they expected the young African leader to understand the rules of the game and play the role assigned to him. The arrogance was palpable, the certainty that, in the end, money and force would prevail. Then, the day of decision arrived. In a speech that would be broadcast to the entire world, Ibrahim Traoré took the podium. The silence was thick, heavy with expectation and apprehension. With a firm voice that did not betray the immense pressure he had endured, he looked into the eyes of his nation and the world and spoke the words that would change the course of history. He rejected the deal, not with hesitation or apologies, but with the conviction of one who speaks for an entire people. He stated, unequivocally, that the resources of Burkina Faso belonged to the people of Burkina Faso and would not be sold for empty promises. He declared that his nation's dignity was not for sale, and that the future would be built with their own hands, with sweat and sacrifice, but in freedom. It was an act of pure defiance, a cry of independence that echoed far beyond his country's borders. The immediate reaction was a shockwave that swept through Western capitals. In Washington, disbelief gave way to fury. How dared a leader of such a small and fragile nation challenge the world's greatest power? The threats, once veiled, became open. There was talk of severe consequences, of economic sanctions that would strangle the country, of financial restrictions that would lead it to collapse. But in Burkina Faso, the reaction was the opposite. An explosion of joy took over the streets. The people, who for so long had felt humiliated and exploited, saw in their leader's decision an act of redemption. People danced, sang, and celebrated not just the rejection of a deal, but the reaffirmation of their identity and national pride. It was proof that the flame of freedom, no matter how much they tried to extinguish it, continued to burn in the African heart. Traoré's decision was not an isolated event. It was the spark that ignited a fire throughout the Sahel region. Leaders of neighboring countries, such as Mali and Niger, who also faced similar pressures, saw in Burkina Faso an example to follow. Expressions of solidarity flooded Ouagadougou. Traoré's stance was framed as part of a broader regional shift, a movement of liberation from Western economic and military dependence. A new alliance began to form, based on South-South cooperation and the mutual defense of sovereignty. The idea of a united Africa, master of its own destiny, which had long been a distant dream, suddenly seemed a real possibility. The gesture of one man had awakened the conscience of a continent. Retaliation was not long in coming. The discontent in Washington materialized into a campaign of diplomatic and economic pressure. Rumors of sanctions and asset freezes circulated, creating a climate of uncertainty and fear. The Western propaganda machine was activated to paint Traoré as an irresponsible dictator, an international pariah who was isolating his country. The objective was clear: to destabilize his government, create internal dissent, and force him to back down or be overthrown. It was the fury of the wounded empire, which did not tolerate being contradicted. The message was a warning not only to Burkina Faso, but to any other nation that dared to follow its example. The price of disobedience would be high, but the loneliness that the enemies of Burkina Faso hoped to impose did not materialize. On the contrary, the nation found strength in the unity and solidarity of its neighbors. Mali and Niger, facing similar challenges, closed ranks with Traoré, forming an axis of resistance against foreign interference. This alliance of the Sahel became a bulwark, a testament that unity is strength. The solidarity was not just rhetorical, it translated into agreements for economic cooperation and mutual defense. Together, these countries began to chart a new path, seeking partners who would treat them as equals, not as vassals. The attempt to isolate Burkina Faso ended up strengthening Pan-African ties and accelerating the divorce from the old colonial powers. With the door to the west closing, Traoré opened a new window of opportunity for his country. The first step was to take back control. The government announced the nationalization of several major mines, which were previously in the hands of foreign corporations. It was a bold move, signaling that the era of exploitation had come to an end. But the vision went further. Instead of just extracting the gold and exporting it as a raw material, the plan was to add value within the country itself. The announcement of the construction of a state-owned gold refinery was a milestone, the materialization of the dream of transforming raw wealth into real prosperity for the people. It was the beginning of a new economic philosophy, focused on self-sufficiency and industrialization. The road ahead, however, was far from easy. The transition from a dependent, extractive economy to a self-sufficient, industrialized model is an arduous journey, fraught with obstacles. The lack of capital, the scarcity of national technology, and the shortage of qualified technical personnel were immense challenges. Furthermore, the hostility of Western powers and international financial institutions created an environment of economic asphyxiation. Every step towards sovereignty was a battle against powerful forces that were betting on Burkina Faso's failure. The nation would need superhuman resilience to overcome adversity and prove that its dream was viable. But Traoré's greatest asset was not in the state coffers or in the mining fields. It was in the hearts of his people. The decision to reject the deal instilled in the nation a new sense of purpose and unity. Ordinary citizens, previously apathetic and distrustful, felt part of something bigger. Patriotism flourished, and a spirit of collective sacrifice took hold of the country. People were willing to tighten their belts, to work harder, to contribute in every possible way to the building of the new nation. It was the energy of a people who, for the first time in a long time, felt that the future was in their hands. This social cohesion became the foundation upon which the new economic policy would be built. As it distanced itself from its old partners, Burkina Faso began to weave new alliances, seeking out nations in the world that shared its vision of a fairer, multipolar global order. Dialogue with countries of the global south, with emerging powers that did not carry the burden of colonialism, intensified. The search was for partnerships based on mutual respect, fair trade, and technology transfer without political conditionalities. The African nation was showing the world that it was possible to diversify its foreign relations, that it was not condemned to orbit around the same centers of power. It was building bridges instead of walls, in a demonstration of pragmatism and sovereign diplomacy. The essence of Traoré's revolution was a paradigm shift in economics. The philosophy that began to guide the country was that true wealth comes not from the simple extraction of resources, but from the ability to transform them. Instead of exporting land and ore at paltry prices, the goal was to export finished products with added value. The gold refinery was just the beginning. The plan was to create a complete production chain that would generate skilled jobs, develop national industry, and ensure that most of the wealth generated by natural resources remained in the country. It was a bet on human capital, on the intelligence and creativity of the Burkinabe people, a declaration that Africa was not condemned to be merely a supplier of raw materials for the rest of the world. In the long term, the vision is of a prosperous, industrialized, and sovereign Burkina Faso, a nation where children study in quality schools, where the sick are treated in modern hospitals, and where young people have decent employment opportunities. A country that is an example for all of Africa, proving that it is possible to achieve development without sacrificing sovereignty. A beacon of hope for all peoples fighting for their emancipation. The journey will be long and difficult, but the seed has been planted. The dream of a nation that controls its own destiny, that lives off the wealth it produces, and that sits at the table of nations as an equal, not as a servant, is more alive than ever. The saga of Burkina Faso and its leader, Ibrahim Traoré, leaves an indelible message for history. It teaches that the true measure of a nation's wealth is not in its gold or oil reserves, but in the courage of its people and the integrity of its leaders. It shows that sovereignty is not a legal abstraction, but an essential condition for dignity and progress. It reminds us that freedom often requires sacrifice and that the path of independence is always more arduous than that of submission. Traoré's decision was more than a political act. It was an act of faith in the potential of his people and a reminder that even in the most unequal arena, Davids can still challenge Goliaths. May the story of Burkina Faso serve as an inspiration to all nations that still find themselves chained to a past of exploitation. May Traoré's know echo in every corner of the world where dignity is negotiated and sovereignty is sold. This is not just the story of an African country. It is a universal call to courage, to self-determination, and to the pursuit of a more just world. The new era for Africa, dreamed of by generations of Pan-African leaders, may finally be dawning on the horizon, driven by the determination of nations like Burkina Faso. And the world watches, some with anger, others with admiration, but no one with indifference, the unfolding of this extraordinary story of defiance and hope.